Welcome to OutSystems Database Entities. In this session, we'd like to talk about data modeling in OutSystems, and part of that data modeling includes entities and static entities. For the entities, we'll talk about the entity attributes, some of the basic data types, and the entity actions. And then we'll talk about the special static entities and their records and how we can use them. So let's go ahead and get started. Data modeling in OutSystems is necessary because applications are going to work with data, and some of that data will need to be persisted inside of a database. And oftentimes that data is sort of compound data that has multiple fields. So to the right here, we can see a data model that was created inside of OutSystems, and we can see that it has an order, and that order has a description, a due date, and other types of information. And that order might be related to its status or its priority, and it could be related to the customer who placed that order. And that customer might have a name and an email and an address. So OutSystems allows us to define these data models and then persist this data. And some of these entities are regular entities and some of them are static entities. So inside of OutSystems, entities have the blue squares, kind of showing that they are data being persisted in a database table. And the static entities have a red stripe, saying that they're not actually going to change, so it shows that they're a little bit different. So entities and static entities will be defined and created by developers in Service Studio. So OutSystems will then manage creating the underlying database tables and everything else, but we only have to define the entities. The rest of the work is done automatically by the system. So inside of OutSystems, an entity is persisted in a database table. And for each new instance of that entity or each new record of the entity, a new row will be inserted in that corresponding table. So a different entity would be created for each different application concept that's needed. And in the data model that we looked at, we saw that there were customers and orders and things like that. And those entities will have fields defined on them, which can be referred to as attributes. So here we can see inside of OutSystems, the entities exist inside of the data tab. And inside the data tab, there's an entities folder. And then there's a type of entity, which is a database entity. And if we want a database entity, we can right-click on the database and say, add an entity. And here we can see the definition of a customer entity. And in this case, it's a non-public customer entity. Now, once the entity exists, then the actual data about the entity is stored in its attributes. So each attribute will end up being a column on the respective database table, and that column and that attribute will have some sort of basic type. Every entity that gets created has a special attribute called its ID attribute. So we want to be able to uniquely identify each entity, and that means that we need some unique identifier, and that will become the primary key inside of the database. And by having this primary key in the database, that supports all of the relational database operations that we might wish to do when we're working with these particular types of entities. So to be able to create an entity attribute, we would go into the customer entity that we had created, right-click on that entity, and then we'll be able to add an entity attribute. And if we added the name attribute, the name will have some sort of name, and in this case, name is the name. And it will have some sort of data type. So obviously the name of the customer is a text attribute, and we can give it a certain length and decide whether it's mandatory because each of these entity attributes has a set of properties that we can set. Now, the basic data types inside of OutSystems that we can select from are, some are alphanumeric, like text and email and things like that. Some of them are numeric, like integers and decimals. Some of them are based around logic, some are focused on dates and times, and then there is that special referential attribute, which we call the entity identifier, and that exists. So here you can see all the different basic data types that OutSystems supports, some examples of what those are, and it also lists the default values that can be used or would be used for each of those data types. Now inside of OutSystems, when we name a new attribute, or any variable that we create as well, OutSystems will try to infer what that data type might be. So if we were to say something like it is the birth date, it would assume that that is a date because it sees that the date exists. If we said something like this was created on, it would assume some sort of date time because created on would happen at a particular date and time. If we use is or has, that means like, does this have a document? The answer would be yes or no, and that's a Boolean. So for each of these data types, OutSystems would attempt to infer what that data type is if it can. So each of these shows you how that will work. So if any of the names occur that it can figure out, it will go ahead and automatically set the data type. But you should always double check to make sure that the data type is set to specifically what you would like it to be. Now, inside of OutSystems, once the entity is created, OutSystems will automatically create what we call the entity actions that go with that particular entity, and it will create an action for each of the CRUD data operations. And when we refer to the CRUD data operations, those are the create, retrieve, update, and delete. And in this case, create is create, retrieve is get customer, update customer, and delete customer. So these entity actions are created for us so that we can use them whenever we need them inside of our application's logic. So once we have an entity, we might wish to be able to create another one. We might wish to be able to update one that exists. So there are 4 parts of the CRUD operations, but you can actually see 6 of them here. And there are 2 special ones. There is the create or update customer and the get customer for update. So what are different about some of those? Well, on this next slide, we can see that the entity actions in detail, here is each one of those entity actions. Each one of them has certain inputs and potentially outputs as well. And then there's a description of each one. So most of these are simple. Create is going to create and insert a new record. The create or update will create a new one if it doesn't exist, but if it does exist, it'll just do an update. Updates make sense. Gets will do the retrieve. The get for update will actually get something out of the database, but it will lock it until the database transaction is finished. So we can kind of hold on to a value and make sure no one else changes it until we do. And then there's also the delete. So you can review the entity actions here in a little bit more detail to understand all the inputs and outputs and exactly what each one of these does, but they generally do what you would think they would do because their names are pretty descriptive. Now, the entities are one set. There is this special type of entity called a static entity. Static entities are entities that will have a predefined set of values. So those predefined set of values will have attributes, and all of this will be defined at development or design time when we're first working with this. The value of a static entity is called a record, and they're called static because the records can't be created, updated, or deleted. They can only be retrieved. So we define them when we first create them, and then every time after that we're just going to have a get to be able to get the static entity. So inside of OutSystems, static entities are often used like enumerations because the static entity is a list of things that really can't be changed. So in this particular case, when we're working with entities, we can add a static entity, and the entities and static entities have slightly different icons. The static entity is the red stripe. And here we can see a priority static entity. And that priority static entity would have a number of different records. So static entities have records, and those records start with 4 attributes by default. They all have an ID, a label, an order, and an isActive. So here we can see we created the static entity priority, and it has records of low, medium, and high. And these records have an ID, a priority, an order, and an isActive. So these are the 4 automatically created ones. But if you look at this a little more closely, and I'm going to move forward real quickly, I said that the label was one of the 4 automatically created, yet there's a priority. Well, that's because although those 4 are created, they can be changed or deleted, and then others can be added. So label was changed to priority, and color code was added as an extra attribute. And then what we do is for each record that we create, we go in and describe the value and set the value of each of these attributes. And we do that as developers in Service Studio at development time. So in this case, the high priority, if we looked at the description of that, we would see that the high priority has a label or a description of high. It's the 3rd one in the list. It is active at the moment, and high priority's color will be red. So if it's high priority, it's very important, we'll make it red, and that will work. When we create the color code is an entity attribute, and we can give it a data type. So in this case, it's just text, but it's mandatory. So when we create a new record, we have to have the color code set so that we know how that is going to work. So in this case, we create static entities that allow us to know a little bit more about how things work if they're low, medium, or high priority. So when we're using static entities, we want to be able to reference them, and if we're going to reference a static entity, it'd be great if we could reference that record by its record name. So yes, all of the records that we create have a unique identifier, and those unique identifiers are often long integers and numbers. But for these static entities that don't change, because we give the record a specific type of name, we can use the record name in place of the static entity's identifier. So as an example, there is a get priority function that's available, and typically it wants the ID of the priority that you're trying to retrieve. Well, instead of having to know the numeric value of that identifier, we could actually just know that and put in that this is the high priority. And then in this case, if we were using this in an application, we could say, let's get the priority, it's a high priority, and that priority, and maybe we're actually trying to use the color code. So we're trying to get the color code for the high priority, which is red. And we could go ahead and set that up here by using the entity priority high, which is the record's name, as the identifier itself. So this is just kind of a helpful feature that's available for static entities when we need it. So that's it. We talked about data modeling inside of OutSystems. We looked at the entities, how to create their attributes, making sure those attributes are one of the basic types, and that there are entity actions automatically available so that when we need to interact or do something to the entity, those actions are there for us to be able to do that. Then we talked about the special entities, which are static entities, and how they have records and how we can use them. So that's it for OutSystems database entities. Thanks for listening.